The ravens arrived at Winterfell like ashless snow, too soft to seem burdened, alighting upon the rookery's ironwork with manners almost courtly. The sky above the first keep was pale slate, its sunlight thinned by high cloud, and every breath of wind carried the clean mineral scent of old stone and hot water loosening frost where the springs threaded the cellars. The maester had the letters brought at once, bound in dark cords that still smelled faintly of sea salt and pitch. He warmed his hands over the brazier while the seals were cracked. 3, then one older, then the newest again. This one bearing the soft impression of a three-headed dragon's head that had mashed the wax just slightly askew, as if a great finger had pressed too hard on the image and left it bruised. Ellen Stark was not there in the tower with the maester and her brother. She was where she always went when winter's breath felt most near. The God's Wood with its pale-barked heart tree and the pool glazed thin with morning ice that cracked under the fall of needles. Snow lay only as a whisper in the shade, and the red leaves trembled around the carved face and made their own quiet talk among themselves that no one else could hear. She wore a dark blue mantle lined in hair, its hood low around her brow, and let her glove rest against the weirwood's cold skin, so that its cold could enter her bones and meet the warmth of her blood. "Ellen," came Brandon Snow's voice from the low stone arch leading in from the covered walk. He did not need to raise it over much. Sound carried here oddly well, traveling across the pool and through the leaves as if the place were very carefully listening. "He has called a council. He will want you there. I wondered if he would." She said, and looked back at the carved mouth, whose lips had been made to look as if they were about to speak. Has he already read them? All 3. Brandon came forward, boots thudding on the damp boards that circled the pool. He had snow still in his hair despite the clear morning. There was something blunt about him today, as if the dampness had smoothed the edges of his anger and left something heavier. Harrenhal burns in every story. They say stones ran like tallow down its towers, and men screamed until their armor popped. She closed her eyes. "Is it true?" "It is true enough to frighten a river," Brandon said, and gestured vaguely to the south. "True enough that the Freys sent their ravens swift and craven both. The Black King is ash, or less than ash. His sons with him. That is the tale." "Balerion did it?" she asked. The name was new to her mouth, and she found she disliked the shape it made with her teeth. "Balerion, they say. Aegon's own. The Black Dread." Brandon's voice was neither awe nor mockery. "And the Queen's dragons too. Vagar and Araxes. Names as if a smith struck a forge with each syllable." "And yet," Ellen said, looking down at her reflection in the skin of the pool, which the cold had made mirrory and dim, "rivers do not burn. They only carry what is put in them. The trident does not choose kings." "Nor does it save them," Brandon said. "Torrin waits for you." The council met in the great hall, as always, beneath banners that showed the gray direwolf racing across Winterfield. Spears crossed behind it to mark the kings of winter, older threadwork than any hand still living remembered. The cooks had not yet fired the great spits, and the air kept a faint breath of old smoke, and the sweetness of the small beer stored in the lower larders. Torches burned long and steady in their iron brackets. Men stood along the wall with brows furrowed and hands rough from frostbit rope and harness. They were not fearful in the way of small folk in southern tales. They had the animal steadiness of men long acquainted with storms. Fear was a hearth companion here, and folk talked with it as they would with an uncle who drank too much. Torrin Stark stood with his hands on the mapboard. In the morning light, he looked lean and gaunt-cheeked, his beard going to iron gray earlier than it should have. He wore no circlet. It rested in the chest near their father's bones, and had not left it since autumn first bit. King of Winter, they called him, but he stood like a steward today, a caretaker of tomorrow. When Ellen entered, he lifted his eyes. They were the particular blue of a clear river in shadow, bright and deep at once. "Ellen," he said quietly, "come." She came to stand opposite him, and there lay the map of their world drawn on oiled kidskin, pinned with river stones smoothed in the hot baths. Bran the Builder's line traced faintly below everything in the north, not as a mark made by a quill, but as if the draughtman had pressed so hard his thoughts had left a bruise. The wall looked like the bone of some dead god. Southward, the 7 kingdoms were drawn in smaller script, their castles made precise by patience, everything closer, warmer, more entangled. Maester Harlan bowed and recited what he had read. He had a beak of a nose and white hair sparse as frost on sedge. He spoke with the distant voice of a man leaving himself behind at the door of duty. King Torrhen, each letter corroborates the other. Lord Edmund Tully of River Run has bent the knee to Aegon of House Targaryen. Orys Baratheon holds Storm's End for his liege and calls himself Lord Paramount of the Stormlands. The rock has yielded after a show of dragonfire and parley besides. The gardeners are ash. He paused there, and when he went on he did it more softly. The gardeners are ash upon the field of fire, and the Tyrells hold the reach by Aegon's gift. The vale is shuttered, and the Eyrie keeps to itself like a bird in winter. But that cannot hold long if the rivers below are tamed. Old Town has opened its gates, and the High Septon has anointed Aegon as king under the 7. Then too. And Dorne? Torrhen asked. Dorne holds. The maester said. It is always said that the desert does not kneel. It only changes its winds. He managed not to look at Brandon for that, which was wise. Torrhen ran his fingers along the trident. And us? What say the south of us? That you march. The maester said. That you are a winter branch yet green. That the dragon will come north after. That their sons will not follow him. They send you courtesies sown over fear. Then? What do you say then? Brandon Snow demanded. He had taken no seat, and his hands were too still by his sides, which was how Ellen knew he was tightly bridled. Speak you as a maester, or as a man who eats at our table? Harlan did not take the bait. I speak as one who reads what is written, he said mildly. And what is written is that the dragons fly where they wish. Torrhen lifted his eyes from the map and looked at Elend. He did not look at Brandon. Ellen felt the look like the touch of winter on ungloved skin. Bracing, sobering, real. And what say you? He asked her. She considered, and not just for the pleasure of being careful. She thought of the heart tree's red tears, and the way the hot spring steamed in the night air behind the glass gardens, and how old stones held warmth long after men had left them. She thought of the stories of the kings of winter that she had been fed as a child like thick porridge. The wolf in the snow, the lord whose word was a fortress better than stone. She thought of children's games in which she had been the crouched hunter in the dark places, and the lantern had been the dragon's eye searching for her. I think, she said, that winter does not bow and does not break. It endures. A dragon burns, and that is its truth. But burning is quick. Winter is patient. If we were to go to the river and set ourselves like reeds, the water would wear us smooth and then take us away. If we set ourselves as ice, it would break us. If we plant our feet as rock, the water might go around us, and the river would call that victory. None. Brandon made a sound in his teeth. She speaks prettily, he said. She speaks to the truth of time, Torrhen said, and his eyes did not leave her face. Go on, Ellen Ductory. If you want a thing to last, she said, you tie it to something older than yourself. She laid her fingers lightly upon the map where Winterfell crouched like a stone animal among its steaming earth. We are older than dragonlords, but not in fire. In another thing, if the dragon wishes to have us, he may have us only by learning our shape. And if he learns it, he must be bound to it. Tied in the way a husband is tied to a wife. Bound and witnessed. Nananani. Silence followed that, and in it, the torches sounded loudly. Brandon said, quite softly, as if the words cost him, you would have Torrhen bend the knee for a marriage? To make kin of them? Would you put a dragon in our bed? Ellen lifted her eyes to his. Our bed is a long one, brother. There is room. She did not add that there was also heat under the stones, and kings had understood this and slept easier for it. They say he has 2 wives already, as is their Valyrian custom. Let him take a third as ours. Let him stand under the face and swear by the old gods, not as king but as man. Let him bind his house life to ours, with names and children and bones that must needs rest among ours. Then when he looks north, he sees not land but kin, and he will not wish to burn his own." Torrhen's fingers tightened on the edge of the board. There were grooves there cut by the knives of other kings at other councils, and his hands found them. A third wife. "It is their custom," Maester Harlan said neutrally. Brandon made a motion apt to be called a laugh. Only because the shape of it was bitter. What would our gods say? What would our fathers' bones say? "The old gods say no words we can hear," Ellen answered. "But they witnessed man and woman long before they witnessed septons and rings. The tree will know what is pledged. And fathers' bones would say only what they always say. Nothing. And something you must feel in the stone beneath your feet." "Then?" Torrhen lowered his eyes again. "And would a Stark woman go to such a marriage?" "I'm a Stark woman," Ellen said. She kept her voice even. "I would go if my king asked it. I would go if our children's children needed it." Brandon closed his eyes then. Just for an instant, as if her words were a blade he could not parry by wit, but must take into the meat. "And if he burns you?" he asked, opening them to meet her gaze. "If this is all pretty talk and the dragon's mouth is only sweet until it closes over you." "Then I will burn," she said. "But I will have burned for all of us, and it may be that the smoke will make a cloud that softens summer into something we can live with. And if he keeps his word, he will be husband and not conqueror when he looks north, and our king can lower his banner, not because it was taken from him, but because he has a place at another table where his knife is set already." Torrhen placed one hand flat on Winterfell and tapped the trident with the other. "We will march," he said at last. "We will march, and we will meet him on the river where the reeds lean. But we will carry more than spears. We will carry a name. Harlan write, Brandon see to the muster, but not as if for the breaking of a siege. We go lean and swift. Ellen." He looked at her, and in his face she saw the boy he had been when he'd carried her piggyback through a thaw flood that had terrified her. "Ellen, find it in you to be braver than a boy who carries his sister where the water wants to take her. Find it in you to let yourself be carried where the water wants to take us all. If that is how it must be." "Then?" She inclined her head, and when she straightened, the godswood's cold was still inside her bones. But it had found friends there. A heat not of dragonfire, but of the springs that ran through Winterfell. Patient and implacable. Warmed by something in the deep that had no quarrel with seasons, only with stone. When they came to the trident, the river was as they had always told it. A braid of waters that sometimes loosened and sometimes pulled tight over stones that shone like fishbacks where the sun touched them. The reeds made lines of music along the wind, but the land did not smell as she had expected. It smelled faintly of wood gone to pitch and meat gone to charcoal, and something else older that crept up from the new-made mud as if the river had been fattened on the sorrow of the burned and was telling everyone so. There were campfires across the far flats and pennons that had not yet decided if they were to fly free or be furled. Aegon Targaryen was taller than the song said, which was perhaps the way of all men who had too much weight in words laid on them. He was hard to look at for the first time, and easy afterward, which Ellen thought a kindness that he might not even know he offered. The Valyrian blood showed in the color of his hair, and what the old grandmother in the glass gardens would have called the light in his eyes. But he was not as fine-boned as the tales painted. He had a soldier's wrists, sinewed and nicked. The black of his armor drank the sun. He had not put on red. She admired that without knowing exactly why. Behind him, Balerion lay like a mountain that had decided to move, and then changed its mind. The dragon's eye was a furnace door half shut. The ground around him was singed black, as if a shadow had been burned into it. They met between their hosts, with the measured slowness that told 1,000 watching eyes something was being weighed. Torrhen had left the circlet in the coffer again and came bareheaded, his hair tied back with a leather thong. The better to see the wind. Aegon wore nothing on his own head either. Men would call that a sign another day, Ellen knew, and argue over who had meant to say what by it. Today, it was only two men meeting without metal between their brows. King Torrhen, said Aegon with a mild bow of his head. His voice was deep, but not loud. It went where it was put, and did not try to drown the river. You have brought winter south with you. I have smelled it along the riverbanks, the breath of your land. Dandurwar. Lord Aegon, Torrin replied. And Ellen watched his face to see where pride would stand today. You have brought the sun north with you. I have felt its heat in letters that told of burning men. Aegon did not smile. His mouth changed very little as he listened, and she wondered if that was habit made by long winters of a different sort, learning to keep the weather off his face. We both bring what we have, he said quietly. And both are true of me, as it is true that I have not come to this place for burning alone. Rhaenys stood at his left shoulder, Visenya at his right. The younger was unsurprised and curious all at once, her hands restless as if she wished always to touch what she was looking at. The elder was a sword sheathed, rather than a sword laid down. Ellen studied them, and let them study her. She saw the small shift of Rhaenys' eyes when they took in the braids at Elend's temple, the way they were tied in the Winterfell fashion, with damp leather thongs, stiff from cold. Visenya's look measured her belt knife, noted the stitching of her boots, the way she held her hands. Each queen learned in her own tongue. Torrin began to speak of armies as if of fields that must be harvested and not left to rot. Men call this river their mother, he said. And men downstream say the river chooses what sort of sons they are. If I choose to be the kind of man who makes orphans of the riverlands to keep the north proud, then I will be proud and orphaned with them, and that pride will be a cold blanket to my children. If I choose to bow, then I keep the children, and I keep the bread, and I keep the long remembering. Yet I do not wish to give you ground like a man beaten. I wish to tie ground to ground. And then he said the words Ellen had tasted in the air of Winterfell, and knew on her tongue before he spoke them to another man. He offered marriage. There was a moment then that was more silence than the river could account for. Rhaenys' mouth parted a fraction, not in surprise but in a kind of delighted thinking, as if she had been offered a clever piece in a game. Visenya's eyes shifted to Aegon as if to say, softly and without need of sound, well, it is a knight's move if we take it so. Aegon did not answer at once. He looked at Ellen as if the offering were not a clause in a pact alone, but a person he must see. She met his gaze without lowering her head. She was aware in the same instant of everything that made up her. The scar on her wrist where the winter trap had bit her when she was 8 because she had been careless with a spring, the familiarity of her own weight in her boots, the particular cut of her braid. She had felt such inventory taken before by men in halls and women in markets. This was neither. This was a hunter looking to see whether the stag at the water was proud enough to take an arrow without running, and whether the arrow was necessary at all. By your gods, Aegon said at last, as deliberately as he might have laid down a sword between them. Not the 7. By the old gods, Torrin returned. Beneath the heart tree whose face looks out upon Winterfell, as it has looked out upon Starks who were not yet named Stark, to be husband to the North in truth, and not as a thing taken by fire, and the North to be bound to your house likewise, so that no storm or summer may undo it. Done? And your daughter? Aegon asked. Your sister, I should say. Ellen stepped forward then, and used her voice as if drawing a blade she had not shown until now, because the moment had not yet asked it. I am Ellen of House Stark, she said. My mother was Lara Manderly, and she taught me the names of fish before she taught me the names of flowers. My father was Arnulf, who died in autumn 3 years ago, standing in the bathhouse doorway with steam in his beard and a smile on his mouth because he had told a good story to the littlest stable hand, and the boy had laughed. I have 3 scars upon me that I can name, and 2 that I will show no one. I know the taste of the first winter apple in the glass garden, and the first black trout of a new thaw. I know that my gods do not speak in words I can hear, but they have faces, and they see. If I swear to be wife to you, I will be that. And if you swear to be husband to me, I will hold you to that, and the gods will hold you harder. Bendal. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw the way his eyes could soften, not as a man's might soften to a child or a song, but as if something in him recognized an old thing in an unexpected place, honesty standing without its cloak. He inclined his head to her, as one might to an armed equal. "Then it shall be," Aegon said. "If your gods will look at us, I will let them. I will send the sept with your leave, and take no candles to the heart tree. The faith may do as it will with the whole world, but not there." 9. Visenya's mouth was a very small line. Rhaenys' smile, by contrast, was a crescent of winter sunlight. Torrhen let his breath out, and it made a small flag of steam in the damp air, like the raising of a banner in miniature. It was done with a speed that would later grow into legend. It is always this way. The quick business of the living becomes the slow song of the dead. They went north not as conquerors, but as guests with an army at their back, and a dragon that shadowed them like a mountain that kept pace. Men along the road stood still and watched as if they were watching a storm that had decided to go by on the next valley, leaving theirs for another day. Women curtsied with stiff skirts and straight backs. Children pointed openly, unashamed of wonder, to the dark thing in the sky and the light one that sometimes matched it stride for stride, and to the woman with the hair like moonlight who rode and laughed and asked their names. At Moat Cailin, the old stones remembered war and shifted their weight as if to see if their old work would be asked of them. But the dragons passed overhead without flame, and the marshes kept their secrets, and the neck's frogs did not cease their evening songs. Reeds bowed and rose. The banner with the wolf and the three-headed dragon stitched upon it newly fluttered flat, and then billowed. Stiff and clumsy plat of two creatures that did not know yet how to run together. Winterfell smelled of wood smoke and wet dog and hot iron, and the sweet mold of old books. Rhaenys asked about the glass gardens at once, and pressed her hands to the panes like a child, when the heat fogged them, and left the marks of her fingers. Visenya walked the yard with eyes like a mason's, measuring walls with her gaze. Aegon went alone to the godswood, and stood some yards off the heart tree, and did not ask to come closer until Ellen brought him forward. She had taken off her gloves so the cold could enter her properly. He had removed his gauntlets as well. They stood then hand to hand in the porous quiet beneath the red leaves, and each watched the other learn to be silent in this place. "What does it say to you?" she asked at last, speaking low because that was how one spoke here. "That I am small," he said, and it sounded like gratitude. "That I am exactly as large as I am, and no larger. That I have burned men and melted stone, and set a crown upon my own head with my sisters, and yet this tree had roots where no man had a name, and it will watch me pass as it watched stone be stone." "Then you hear more than most," she said. "Some come here and think the wind is a voice and the leaves are words. It is what you bring to it that speaks." He inclined his head and looked up into the red. "I have not had much that was not mine to command," he said. "Perhaps that is why I hear it. Or because you are willing to try," she said. "Willingness is a language here." The wedding was made at dusk when the steam from the lower baths rose into the evening air and made the hallways varnished with a faint sheen, and the brazier flames stood especially blue. There was no septon. There were no crystals hung to catch the light. There was the heart tree and the faces of the dead looking on from the crypt, where the doors stood open for that purpose, and the living who were bound to them by name and blood. Torrhen said the words a brother says when he lays his sister's hand in another man's, and does not pretend it does not cut him. Ellen spoke like a woman walking into a river for the first time in spring, when the ice is gone, and the water has not yet forgiven the ice for being gone. Aegon spoke like a man who knows he can be heard, and is grateful for it. When they were bound, it was with a cord of wolf-gray wool and dragon-black silk, braided together by a woman of the kitchens, whose mother had braided Torrhen's swaddling cords, and who had not thought she would live to see this day, and yet she had. The old gods did not speak. The wind did not rise. The leaves did not flutter any more than they always did. And yet Ellen felt a loosening in the air, as if a knot tied somewhere in the stone of Winterfell had been released, and the heat of the springs could enter some new place and make it ready for living. After, there was feasting. The cooks had done joy from necessity, which is the finest kind. There were stewed mushrooms with garlic that had overwintered in dry straw, and came out sweet, and turnips roasted to tenderness and glossed with their own juices, and venison red enough to shame a maester, and river fish laid on beds of fennel, and eaten with fingers that smelled of green things after. Rhaenys learned the names of the dishes, and asked the women who had made them how long to boil this, or when to turn that, and laughed when girl lied to her for fun, and then told her the truth a moment later. Visenya sat as if the table were a line of march, and the knives were her scouts, and each candlestick a sentry. Aegon ate lightly, and drank less, and watched the room as if it were a tide, watching to learn what kind of moon pulled it. Brandon Snow drank enough to tell the truth. Sometime after the third course he stood and lifted his cup to Ellen and to Aegon, and said, "I have hated you in my mind, and in my mouth, Dragon Lord. I have sharpened the hate like a knife, thinking one day I would climb on your shadow and cut you where your scales were soft. I have planned to die for it so that when they told the story of your death and mine, they would say both names together. I am not ashamed of that. Men remember what men make them remember. But," he paused, eyes on Ellen, "but my sister has braided wolf wool to dragon silk, and she has done it under eyes that I fear more than yours. If she says the knot holds, I will call it a good knot. And if I must bite it with my teeth to keep it from slipping, then I will do that also." The hall breathed. Aegon raised his cup and inclined it to Brandon. "It is a hard thing," he said, "to bury a weapon you have loved. I will not ask you to bury it where I can find it. Keep it. Use it for us if the day asks it." Later, Ellen and Aegon walked the damp corridors where the liquid shine of the spring's breath made the stones gleam. She showed him how the warmth could be felt through a thin leather sole, and how there were rooms which needed no fire year-round because of the hot veins below. He bowed his head before each small miracle as if greeting it. She did not know if he meant it in courtesy or in truth, but decided it did not matter. Courtesy becomes truth where it is practiced long enough. When they came into the small chamber set aside for them, the fire was already made, and a basin of water set on a tripod nearby sent up little ghosts. She dismissed the women with a look and a nod, and Aegon dismissed the men with a word. And then she stood still and waited for the part of herself that had been armor at the council table and braid at the god's wood and stone along the road to loosen. It did not, and she thought, "Good. Let it stay a while. He will have the measure of it, or he will not. And both are truths I can live with." He came to stand beside her at the narrow window that looked down into the practice yard, now empty of all but a single kennel hound curled in a hollow of old snow. "I married my sisters," he said without preface, and the words were simple as if he named the states of weather. "That was our way, and it seemed to me a good way. I have thought myself a man of simple appetites and a simple destiny. Fire that makes a path where I ask it to go. I am not sorry for that path. Yet I have come into a house where the heat is below the floor, and the warmth is a patience that rises whether I ask it or no. I will learn this house if I am to live in it. Then," she set her palm on the cool stone of the window's embrasure, "I married a man who thinks himself a simple destiny," she said. "But you are not. Men who burn stone are never simple. Fire is a kind of thinking. I will learn that if I am to live with it." She turned her head and looked up at him. He was near enough that she could see a white line near his left ear where some blade had kissed him in youth. "I do not know how to be a third wife in the way your gods say wives should be," she said. "I know only how to be a first wife in the way our gods say wives should be, where they say anything at all. I will be that." He took that without flinching. "Be that," he said. "I will not ask you to be less." They undressed each other with the clumsiness of strangers who are determined not to be clumsy for long. He touched her, as if tracing letters on a wall he had not expected would be his to read. She touched him as if finding the edges of a tool she might come to wield expertly if the work asked for it. When they lay together, there was no fire in the room that had not been there already. The hot breaths from the springs below made their own intimacy. He was not rough. He was not overly gentle. He was a man who chose not to hurry because haste would be a kind of insult to a house that had waited so long to open this chamber's door to him. In the morning, a raven knocked at the diamond-paned window until it was let in, indignant and implacable, and left a black feather on the sill, before flying off to the rookery with its work finished. News had the habit of lining up outside people's lives like petitioners. There was always another message. This one spoke of the riverlands solidifying like cooling steel, and the rock settling into its new shape, and of Dorne as sand that refused all molds. It spoke of the High Septon's mild displeasure, and of Maester's eagerness to write the new name for the new union. The Pact of Ice and Fire, some were already calling it, and Ellen tasted both pomposity and accuracy in it. That is how good names often are. Visenya met Ellen in the yard, among the hounds and the keep lads. It was half-light still, and the kennel master's whistle cut the air neat as a coin. Visenya had the look of someone who slept in iron and had not minded it. My brother makes vows and he keeps them. She said by way of greeting. When he swore the first marriage, I told him it would be a sword in his hand. When he swore the second, I told him it would be a banner at his back. I do not know what this one is. Perhaps a shield he can stand behind when the world is unreasonable. Perhaps a wall he cannot breach when he wishes to be unreasonable himself. And now, Ellen stroked the head of the nearest dog, whose ears were ragged from winter's rough love, and whose sighs were human. A wall is not an enemy to a man who lives in a land of wolves, she said. A wall is a friend. It keeps out the weather that wants to kill you, and keeps in the heat that wants to be yours. If you think your brother will lean his back against it sometimes and be glad, then we have made something worthwhile. Visenya's mouth made the smallest of curves, visible only if one was looking for it. I am not a woman to look for gladness, she said, but I will look for this. Then, in a different tone, like a blade turned for polishing, teach me your yard. Ellen put a spear in Visenya's hands then, and took one herself, and they found the measure of each other on packed snow, so that when they tired there was respect enough to drink together in the steamy minor hall, and speak without the fence of suspicion between them. Rhaenys found them there and tried the spears herself, and laughed until she could not draw breath, not with mockery, but with sheer delight at new motion. Teach me to catch a trout with my hands, she demanded of Ellen later. And Ellen did, and Rhaenys failed and laughed and failed again, and at last succeeded, and whooped. And the trout's scales flashed like coin in winter light. Aegon sat with Torrhen in the solar where the windows looked over the glass gardens, and the steam made the panes weep. They bent together over maps as men do, who are not enemies and not yet brothers, but learning the grammar of each other's thoughts. They spoke of roads and granaries. They spoke of the wall. Aegon asked questions of it that had not been asked in living memory by men who could cause dragons to lower their heads. Torrhen answered what he could, and did not pretend knowledge where the old stones did not open for words. They spoke of the Ironborn, and their old habit of taking what was not tied down, and sometimes what was. They spoke of the sea, which is a kind of dragon, if you look at it often enough. Leave the north to me, Torrhen said at last carefully. I do not say it possessively. I say it as a man might say, leave this infant to its mother. She knows its cries better than any other. We will send men south to roads you wish and grain where you need it. We will take your men when they must learn our snow, and teach them when they do not. We will light watchfires for the wall, and watch them when weather swallows them again. But leave the north to me. Men go. Aegon leaned back and looked at him as if measuring a beam to see if it would bear the roof tossed on it. Then he nodded. So long as my sons with your sister know its stones as well as yours do, he said. So long as when I am ash and they are bone, the wolves they carry on their breastplates are not painted on by convenience, but grown there with their names. We can do that, Torrhen said. His mouth twitched. We do names well. In the weeks that followed, the castle learned to make space for Dragon and Dragon Lord both. Balerion did not curl in the yard as a hound might. He preferred the broken land beyond the winter town, where the springs made fog that hid a creature of his size imperfectly, and made him into a story for children who peeked and never dared go as far as their bravest friends bragged they had gone. Vagar and Meraxes took the old quarry as their place. There the stone walls remembered being broken and did not mind being warm. The blacksmiths cursed softly at the warping of their work, when a dragon flew low, and the heat changed a minute's labor into an hour's folly, and then learned to look up and put their irons aside when shadows fell. The kennel dogs learned not to bark. It was not fear, but a new kind of knowledge. This too is part of the pack now, in its way. Ellen sat with the castle women, and learned which of them had husbands at White Harbor, who would send her shellfish if she wrote at once, and which of them knew the trick of keeping lentils sweet through a damp winter. She listened to their recitations of who had married whom and how many children had come of it, and which babies had died, and which had lived, and what the dead had taken with them, of their mother's strength and their father's tempers. She thought of sons whose hair might be white as milk, and eyes strange as a falcon's, and whose bodies would smell of snow, and iron, and hot springs. She thought of daughters who would run barefoot along the bathhouse corridors with their skirts hitched up and shout at ravens and call them old men. She thought of the tree's face that would watch them all and not say a word. One night, as late winter leaned toward its breaking, and the snow went soft underfoot and made an old man sighing at each step, Aegon spoke of the south and of the noise it made. "They sing of me there," he said, and the words did not sit easily in his mouth. "They sing that I came on a tide of fire and that the crowns fell into my hands like apples from a shaken bough. They sing that I will make all roads straight and all harvests heavy. They sing as if I were a season and not a man." "What do you want sung?" Ellen asked him. He turned the question over with the care of a man handling a hot coal. "That I kept my word," he said finally. "That I did not make the world worse than I found it in my particular way. That when I lay down, the work I had set my hands to could be picked up by others without burning them." "Now, you speak like a mason," she said, half smiling. "I have always envied masons," he said, surprising her. "They make their names in stone. I make mine in breath and in ash. And yet," he looked at her, "the north may be my stone. It may be that our children make mortar with their blood, as all great houses do, and their laughter fills the cracks as the better kind of mortar, and the wall stands because of both." "And Dorne?" she asked. "Dorne is a wind that must be met with wind." He did not speak lightly. "I will not burn them unless they force my hand. They will find me patient in the way of your springs rather than your snow." "Then perhaps," she said, "this is the shape of your reign. Patience where fire would be easy, heat where cold would be customary, oaths where swords once sufficed." "Perhaps," he said. He reached for her hand, and in that room where the breath of the earth rose, their fingers were too warm to feel like the hands of northern folk at all. "Or perhaps it is the shape of ours." Word went out slowly at first, and then like water freed from a dam. Men in the Riverlands told one another that the wolf had shared his den with the dragon, and the dragon had left his fire outside the door, because the den had its own warmth. At the Rock, merchants stamped coins with a wolf's head on one side and a dragon's on the other, and charged a novelty's price to small folk who wanted to hold the new order in their hands. In Old Town, the Hightowers set their lamps at such a brightness that the night looked like a harbor in daylight, and the maesters wrote long letters in ink too fine for the winter-tough fingers of northern men to light. On the Iron Islands, men scoffed, then looked to their ships, then argued among themselves in feast halls where the air was thick with smoke and the smell of salt and pride, and in the end, as always, they looked to the sea to decide what they would be. In Dorne, women looked up from their looms and said, "We shall see," and the men who fancied themselves masters of those women thought they had said something else, and were wrong. At Winterfell, the springs did what they had always done. The glass gardens glowed at dawn like small fires refused by the old gods. The heart tree watched and bled its leaves in the old season, and grew them again in the new. Children were made and born. Treaties were written. Roads were measured, and then lay long and wet under rain and frost heave, and the boots of men in mail and the bare feet of children. Ravens came and went and left black feathers on windowsills. Balerion exhaled, and the air tasted of iron. Vagar and Meraxes argued with crows politely in the high cold air that belonged to all creatures. Brandon Snow went off into the wall, and came back with silence stitched to his shoulders. He brought words with him as well when asked. Of a night wind that crept like a thief along the top of the world, of men in black who were not heroes so much as husbands to a lonely duty, of ice that moved in its own slow thinking. He told Aegon what no one in the south could tell him, and told Ilyn what she already knew, and put better words to it. Once, in the deep night, Ilyn woke with the certain knowledge that there would be a winter child. She did not have to put her hand to her belly to know it. It was a knowing like knowing where the nearer hearth is in a dark house. She lay with eyes open, in the warm dim, and thought of names, and of how they make bridges, and how sometimes they make walls. She thought of a name that had wolf's breath in it, and dragon's iron. She did not say it aloud. Names said aloud too soon become hungry. When she slept again, she dreamed of the heart tree, not with the fear that sometimes came upon her in childhood, of its eyes shifting and looking full at her, but with the odd comfort of being watched by something that had learned her shape and approved of it, enough not to move. In the morning, she told no one of the dream, and went to the kitchens to learn the turn of a thick soup the cook promised would stay gentle in her belly when the seas in there began to move. A lane of copper was hammered into place along one of the great halls that winter, a long strip to catch candlelight and carry it farther. Men would say later that the smiths had done it to please a dragon lord's taste. The smiths themselves said nothing at all. They hammered and riveted and polished, and in the shining metal, Ilyn saw a long snarl of light that looked like a river if a river had been made to lie along a wall. Children ran their hands along it until the cook smacked them away. Aegon stood before it once, long, and then said only, "Stone is honest with itself. So is metal. I like this." Then, spring came the way it does in the north, with cruelty first, and then remorse. The snow melted and then fell again, and then it rained until the castle smelled like a root cellared too long. Then the first shy greening came, and the air had a taste like biting into something living. The heart tree made new leaves. The ravens grew restive in the rookery, and fought and made peace in 1 hour. Women opened the highest windows and beat winter out of blankets with sticks. Men took off their gloves to feel the handles of their tools bare in their hands again. The dragons lifted higher, less weighed by the heaviness of the low cold air, and were not so much things as arguments written on the sky. On a day when the rain had washed the yard new and left the stone flags shining like seals' backs, a delegation came from White Harbor. They came with a cask of pickled oysters for the queens and fine blue cloth, deep as an evening sky for Ilyn, and letters from the Manderless, for Aegon wrapped neat as fish. The Lord of White Harbor wrote with a graceful hand and a certain humor that told Ilyn he had decided to be delighted by what had happened, rather than dismayed by it, and that decision had become its own kind of truth. He proposed ships. He proposed measures of grain. He proposed marriages he suspected he had no right to propose, but did anyway, smiling in ink at the audacity of it. Aegon laughed at that letter and said, "He is a southern lord born wrong way round," and dictated an answer with good temper that would cement a friendship made of trade and wit. Ilyn watched him and thought, "He is learning the grammar. The North has its own conjugations of power. He puts the verbs in the right places more often now." There were other letters. There are always other letters. Some asked, some commanded, some scolded, some praised, some insinuated, some lied with the most earnest ink. The High Septon wrote with a tone like a clean blade wrapped in silk. He did not say he disapproved, and he did not say he approved. He asked that Aegon not make of the North a place where other men would run to escape their rightful tithes. He asked that there be no burning of septs. He asked that the new coin bear the 7 stars somewhere small upon it. Aegon replied in a letter written half in his own hand, half in a scribe's, that Winterfell would not be made a harbor for men who wished to cheat God, and that he would not burn a sept in a land where there were so few to begin with, and those mostly for travelers who already felt far enough from home. The coin he promised would show the truth, wolf and dragon, and if there were stars to be had, they would be the kind that appear on a winter night when the sky is clear and the breath of the world is visible, and the old gods do not mind sharing it. Rhaenys left for a time with Meraxes to see the way the neck looked from above, on a day when the fog lay like a sleeping animal, and the reeds were its fur. She returned rosy with stories and gifts for the cook and tricks with a spear Ellen had not yet learned. Visenya left also, and returned with no stories, and a mood like tempered steel. Which is to say, it had the capacity to surprise, but chose not to. Aegon went nowhere. He remained with Ellen and with Winterfell, and with the busy talk of a castle that had decided it would like to be the center of a thing, and was pleasantly roomy enough to be it. A day came when the first fish of spring were brought wriggling from under the ice edge and slapped upon the stones and cleaned and cooked, and eaten with a reverence disproportionate to their size. Ellen ate and felt the child turn just enough to say, "I am here." She set her hand low on her belly and did not meet anyone's eyes in case what she was feeling would be read there. Aegon saw anyway. He saw the way her mouth softened and the particular way she held herself. Slight as a shift of weight, a commander learns to notice in a line before it breaks. He did not speak of it until they were alone. Then he knelt and kissed the skin where his son or daughter lay like a small vow. "I do not know if my mother felt this," he said, and the melancholy in his voice was a kind that did not ask for gentling. "I do not know if my father ever knelt to such a thing. You do." She said, and held his head in her hands for a long moment, because there are some acts that must be given weight by witness. In White Harbor, a shipwright laid out plans for a vessel that could bear more cargo than any built there yet, and thought with satisfaction of a line of such ships carrying northern grain south and southern wine north, until the taste of each place lived in the other. In the Vale, a boy with a stammer learned from his mother that men in dragons' shadows had chosen not to cast one where a wolf slept, and found that his nightmares had gentled of their own accord. At the rock, the smith who struck the new dies for the coin stamped wolf and dragon until his own hands ached, and went to bed at night with the sound of a wolf's footfall and a dragon's wing in his ears, and smiled in his sleep. In Dorne, a woman of Sunspear set a little carved wolf beside the little carved dragon on her mantle, and said to her lover, "There, now we shall see which eats which," and her lover laughed and said, "Perhaps they will breed instead." It is an easy thing to say a marriage secured the North without war. It is harder to show what was secured because there was no fire to make it bright. It was secured in barrels of salt fish shipped, where they must be shipped so that men in the South could taste winter and be grateful for it. It was secured in letters between a lord of White Harbor and a queen of dragons that contained recipes alongside the widths of keel beams. It was secured in a soldier from the Stormlands who came north to stand watch upon a road and learned the comfort of a hot hall after a day of bitter wind, and wrote to his mother that she should not worry. The people here fed him as if they had known him always. It was secured in a child born with hair pale as milk, who laughed at the steam rising off a bath and made 3 old women cry quietly because it sounded like something coming right from a place beneath the floor. When the child was born, the old gods did not speak, and the 7 did not sing, and dragons did not cry out. The women did their work. Ellen did hers. Aegon waited with the patience of a man who has learned patience late, and therefore holds it as something very nearly sacred. Torrhen stood in the corridor and made the same small line of steam with his breath he had made at the Trident, and thought, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he was not a king in the old sense anymore, and that this was not a sadness. Brandon Snow stood at the bottom of the tower stairs and told a story to 3 boys who would have been in the way otherwise, and made them laugh and forget that they were afraid of what men sometimes die of. The child was a boy. He was put to Ellene's breast and did what all true-born children do. He took what the world offered with the unashamed hunger that is both a blessing and a prophecy. He had a small mouth and a noise like a pup. His eyes were the indeterminate darkness of all newborn eyes, and the women argued immediately over which gods had put what into them. They named him Artos, a name with the echo of old wolves in it, and in Dragonstone letters the name looked foreign enough to please men who liked foreign things, and in Winterfell letters it looked like it had always been carved on the stones. Aegon held him as if he had been trained for it, and had only had to wait until now to show his proficiency. Ellen watched and learned his hands again in this new occupation. The dragons lay quiet for 3 days while the castle learned the child's smell. And if that is only a fancy, it is the kind of fancy that makes men better, and that is reason enough to keep it. On the 7th day, they took Ardos to the godswood. The air was thick with the smell of thaw and old leaves, and the iron tang of earth waking. The heart tree looked down with its usual indifference that is not unkindness. Aegon stood with Ellen before it, his hair unbound for once, and spoke a little under his breath. She did not ask what he said. He tied a thin twist of wolf gray and dragon black about the child's wrist. She did not tell him that it would get filthy and fall off. It fell off a week later and was found by a kennel pup that made of it a toy and was admonished for it, and then forgiven, as all pups are for their small thefts. When summer came that year, it did not come with the giddy fanfare of southern summers. It came like a woman opening shutters in an old house, letting light in where it had not been but might be expected if one knew houses. The dragons took higher air, and from the height they looked down upon a long land with a new braid of meanings running through it. Roads drawn not only to move men to war but to carry wool and iron and news, faces in the yard more various, both spoken in 2 languages that were beginning the work of becoming one. Men in the south began to speak of the north as a place one might go, not only to die for honor, but to live for coin. Men in the north began to speak of the south not only as a place full of lies and heat, but as a place where one's cousin might marry and send back lemons for a feast and a song with a tune that stuck in the ear. And always, there was the warden's watch to the far north. Torrin made of it a ritual that would outlast him. Each year, a party to the wall, not to show southern eyes a curiosity, but to remind northern eyes a truth. Aegon went once. He stood upon the ice and looked out into the white longness and said nothing. Ellen stood next to him and felt the old fear that lives in all northerners, like a nodding acquaintance. He reached for her hand and did not squeeze it too hard, because he had learned that the hand you hold in winter must be held with the knowledge of what it will need in spring. There were letters again. Some always. Dorn again, this time, with a tone like a smile and a knife carried elsewhere than the belt. The High Septon again, this time offering blessing in flowery phrases that were carefully neutral as a map might be. The Rock again, this time with a blot of wine on the corner where a lord had drunk and forgotten his manners and the scribe had not. White Harbor, again and always, with accounts and jokes and a story about a cook's romance with a stable lad that was told as if it mattered because in a good city, all such stories matter. On a morning when mist hung in the yard and Ardos was learning to crawl with the unsteady determination of the very brave, Ellen took him to the window and showed him the yard and told him the names of all the ordinary things. Stone, she said, and let him pat the sill. Dog, she said, when the hound below shook himself into a spray like rain. Man, she said, when Brandon Snow looked up and saw them and lifted a hand. Tree, and meant the heart tree, though it was out of sight. Sky, she said, and in that moment, a dragon crossed it, a dark moving mountain, and the child laughed a high, breathless laugh and clapped. Aegon, hearing that, came, and they stood together watching the way the moving shadow made even the most stubborn of stones look different for a heartbeat. And Ellen thought, there, that is the thing we have made. Not the shadow itself, but the way the shadow falls. Where it is permitted, where it is softened, where it is refused. The shape of it over years. The braid of wolf and dragon drawn long and level, like a river taught a new bed that followed the lay of the land, rather than defying it. It would not be simple. It would not stay still. Roads crack. Coins are clipped. Songs are made and make lies, and then truth again by being sung enough. There would be days when Visenya's spear would be needed, and days when Rhaenys' laugh would change the temper of a hall. There would be winters that gnawed the corners of the land until men could not remember warmth without bitterness, and summers that tempted men to think they had no need of gods because their bellies were full. There would be sons who took their fathers' names and made them into other things, and daughters who found that walls could be friends and prisons, both and were clever enough to tell the difference. There would be moments when a dragon's breath would be called for to cauterize a wound that would have bled the realm white if left to fester, and moments when the dragon must be called back because his shadow would make more enemies than his fire would make peace. But on that morning, with mist on the yard and the hot breath of the earth rising up through the old stones, and a child laughing at a moving mountain, the world held a balance it seldom advertises. Ellen held that balance in her arms and felt the weight of it as a weight she would willingly carry, until she could not. Aegon's hand on her back was not a command or a claim. It was acknowledgement. The old gods watched and said nothing. The seven were not invited and were not offended, for gods have more patience than their priests in such matters. The wolf on the banners stirred in a draught that smelled of iron and green. The dragon on the new coin was a fresh thing in the hand, and had not yet been rubbed thin where men's fingers always rub away at faces. Somewhere to the south, in a hall where the sunlight was hotter and the wine sweeter, a singer wrote the first verses of a song that would be called "The Binding at the Heart Tree," and get almost everything wrong but the key thing right. That a woman with hair the color of raven's wings stood under red leaves with a man whose eyes had looked into fire and not blinked, and each had bowed their heads to something older than either of them because they wished to build a thing that would not fall. When they were ash, the song would later be sung at harvests, and at the naming of infants, and at the last cups at feasts where too much had been drunk, and men wanted to remember a gentler triumph than the bloody ones they usually cheered. It would be sung in the yard at Winterfell, when men mended harness and women strung beams to dry. It would be sung by a mute boy who learned to drum the tune with his knuckles so well the rhythm was enough. It would be hummed by a sleepy queen while she counted her son's breaths. Ellen did not yet know that song. Not then. She knew only the sound of her child's laughter and the hush of the springs, and the knowledge that she had tied her house to another with a cord that felt both fragile and unbreakable. That is the paradox of good knots. They look weak because they move when tugged, but it is their moving that makes them hold. She knew that, and she knew the face of the heart tree, and she knew the taste of that morning's air. Sometimes that is all history requires of its makers. To know the small details so fully that the large ones cannot help but be shaped by them. The first thing Artos learned was to sleep anywhere heat gathered. He dozed with the weight of his cheek against Ellen's breast, and on the smooth stones warmed by the springs where a rug had been thrown for him, and against Aegon's cuirass when his father forgot to remove it before lifting him, and only remembered when the boy's hands found a strap and tugged. The second thing he learned was the sound of raven wings. He would turn his head toward the rookery when they fussed and croaked, a frown of grave study pulling his brow, as if the noise were a lesson written for him alone. When he was 2 months old, and the snow had given way in the inner yards to a skin of mud, the color of new bread, Aegon said, "I must go down river and set a camp where a city will be. Come with me. Let him see it before anyone gives it a name he cannot change." "Will you make a city out of mud?" Ellen asked, walking with him through the glass gardens where the steam beaded Rhaenys' hair into soft curls and made the Dragon Queen look almost like a girl. She had been teaching the kitchen girls a reach song about lemon cakes until the fog turned her laugh into rain. "I have made kingdoms out of worse," Aegon said mildly. "Mud listens if it is told the right stories with stone and wood and coin." Visenya, passing between beds of winter peas with her hands behind her back, said without turning, "Mud listens if it is told with a sword at its ear." Ellen looked at the finger-wide leaves trembling under glass, and thought of roads that would have to be measured and argued with as stubbornly as any lord. "We will go," she said. "Torrhen will bear Winterfell in our absence and enjoy doing it. He likes the company of old stones without questions." Bell. They traveled in a time that had forgotten itself. Winter's breath in the morning, spring's wet mouth by noon, and at night a summer softness that made even the iron of mail feel less unfriendly. The host was not a conquering one. It moved like a caravan of intentions. Carpenters came with axes that had learned northern wood, and would now be taught southern. Masons brought plumb lines, and the patience of men who know a wall is argued with inch by inch, and never won by shouting. Scribes packed sand for drying ink, and the humility to write the same sentence thrice until the words lay flat. The dragons paced the column in the air. Balerion moved like a storm that had decided to stay coherent for politeness' sake. Vhagar and Meraxes traded heights, as if each preferred a different measure of sky. At Moat Cailin, the marsh's breath rose, green and old. Ellen watched Aegon lay his hand upon a stone that remembered much and had no language for it. And she watched the way his eyes half closed as if listening. Some men speak to gods, some to maps, and some to the kinds of silence that hold the shape of old work. They went on into the neck, where the road is a suggestion more than a fact, and reeds are magistrates. The Crannogmen watched them pass like fish watching a moon, aware, unconcerned, remembering. When at last the Blackwater's mouth opened, it did so with a breath of tar, tide, and promise. The shore was a ragged crescent of shingle and silt, crab scuttle and gull cry. A place men had used and left, and used again without courtesy. The river was neither blue nor brown, but each in turn, changing its mind under the eye of the sky. There were a few huts, a few sheds where fishermen had fixed nets, with the grim affection of men who mend what will always be broken by use. Aegon dismounted and stood with his boots in the sucking mud, and smiled, as if some private wager had gone in his favor. "Here," he said, "here where the river brings the world's arguments and the sea asks them to be brief. We will begin with a fort, something small and honest, something that admits it is temporary and dares to be great anyway." He called it nothing that day, not even Aegon Fort. He called it a job. Men set posts. Women tied rope. Rhaenys directed carts as if she had been born to logistics, and had only been delayed by dragons. Visenya paced the perimeter and planted markers with a soldier's eye for angles and lines of fire. Ellen walked the higher ground with a babe asleep against her, and felt where the wind chose to pass, where the fog would settle, where carts would bog unless the earth was laid with brush and layered like pastry until it could bear weight. That night, they ate fish pulled from the river as the last light bruised the water. Aegon spoke little at the fire. When he did, it was to ask a carpenter why he preferred oak pegs to iron nails for a thing that must be fastened with all speed. "Because pegs tell you when they are wrong," the man said, startled into poetry. "Iron lies. It holds until one day it doesn't, and you never saw where it began. Wood complains and complains until you listen." "Nam? Then we will build with many complaints," Aegon said, "so we can answer them in time." Messengers came like summer flies. Orys Baratheon arrived in person, broad and easy, with Argella Durandon's sun-browned hand on his forearm, and a smile in his beard that told Ellen she would like him in any weather. He bowed to her as one bows to a woman whose work can be seen without asking. "My queen," he said. The word sat light on his tongue. Not hostile, not oily. "I've brought you lemons the size of a septon's conscience and a wheelwright who swears he can turn clay to stone if you give him enough straw." Argella kissed Ellen's cheek and smelled of horse and salt air. "Your hot springs are the only thing I envy in the world," she confided, looking past Ellen to where the baby slept. "Those, and that child. What is his name?" "Artos," Ellen said, and the proud softness in her voice was a thing she could not hide even if she had wanted to. "Then he will bite," Argella said, and laughed. "May he bite only men who deserve it." Shara Aaron's letter came with a white falcon's feather folded inside it, and a scent of mountain air that was pure trickery of clean parchment and a careful hand. She sent Ronald's regards. The boy remembered the dragon ride as a dream he had been permitted to make true. And he told everyone in the Eyrie that one day he would take his wife to see a dragon, as if such a thing were a jaunt on a sunny road. Shara wrote in a manner that did not beg and did not bow. It laid out the cost of any alliance in mountain coin, and expected a fair counting. Ellen liked her at once. She wrote back with Winterfell's courtesy, which is to say without flourishes, and with exact nouns for things that did not need adjectives. Between those letters, something was built that no storm would find easy to take down. From Old Town came a scroll thick as a man's wrist, full of the High Septon's blessing crowded with his caution. He wished the king long days and mild weather. He wished the north contentment and the light of the Seven. He wished, without saying so, that a marriage beneath a heart tree would not teach small folk to think they could wriggle out of God's tidy nets. Aegon read with a face that gave back nothing, then handed the thing to Ellen. "Tell him," he said, "that we do not teach men to escape God. We teach them to eat and sleep and keep their oaths. And if God is offended by that, he will have to come north and say so himself." Ellen sharpened that into ink and sanded it smooth. When she sealed it, she thought of the sept in the winter town, of the candles that burned there for travelers, and for manderly wives who missed the sound of a priest's voice, and she thought, "We will be careful. We will not break what feeds someone just because we do not eat it ourselves." They set the first stones of the fort in a light rain that made the mortar slower to dry and tempers slower to fray. Aegon's hand went to the first stone not because it was a king's hand, but because he liked the weight of work. "For now," he said, and looked at Eileen as if to make her witness to a vow made to mud, "we will be honest about what this is. A wooden keep on a hill of earth and will, no marble until we have earned it." The day the fort took a shape that a child could draw, 2 mummers came with a painted cart and behaved like delight stitched into clothes. That was their calling. They juggled apples. They made a pretend king from a broom and a donkey and bowed to it until even Visenya's mouth remembered the impulse to smile. They asked for an audience to bless the new seat with a silly play. Aegon allowed it. He was not a man to close his hand around harmless things just to prove his hand could close. In the play, a dragon slept, and a fox crept, and everyone laughed when the fox tripped over its own tail and fell into the dragon's maw. The second mummer leaned upon his staff and told the old tale of the smith who tricked winter and stole a day. It was at the end, when the laughter had softened into the noise of men shifting their feet and thinking of supper, that the staff became a spear, and the apple became a knife. One came for Aegon's belly, the other for his throat. Visenya's arm was a drawn bow. Her blade was a thought that had been waiting to be said aloud. She cut one across the wrist so neatly the hand did not understand at first. It had let go. Oris was on the other before breath could be inhaled again for shouting. He wrestled the would-be king-killer to the ground with a grunt that had nothing of court in it. The assassin bled and tried to laugh and succeeded only at coughing. He was Dornish by his speech, or what was left of it for those who listened. Men of the Reach murmured, and some reached for torches, as if the answer to any pain must be flame. Aegon stood with a strip of his tunic pressed to the nick at his own neck and said, very calm, "There will be no fires set for this. We do not burn men who have already failed." Visenya looked at him with a look that Ellen had learned meant she was pleased, and would not say so in front of others. Later, in the low room where the wind made ladders on the walls, and the fire worked patiently at the damp, she laid a hand upon Aegon's shoulder, and said the thing history would put in her mouth. "You will have a guard. 7. White cloaks, oaths with teeth. If the faith objects, let them write their objections on air." He did not argue. He did not argue because he had felt the breath of death and found it sour, and because Visenya's instincts were old and graven. Names were said in the hall that night, like stones set in a foundation. From White Harbor came Sir Richard Manderley, who prayed to the 7 on his knees, and to the old god standing up, and had learned to do both without offending either. From the Stormlands came a man whose name would be carved on a marble someday, and then rubbed smooth by history's thumb. From the Riverlands a long-boned knight who had learned to fight in water up to his thighs. From the Reach a man with hands elegant as a scribe's and a temper like a bull's. From the Vale a man who remembered to look up when others forgot the sky as part of any battlefield. From the Rock a knight who had never lost a tourney and never bragged of it from Dragonstone. From the Rook. Visenya looked at them and found them good. She draped white upon them, as if covering smoldering coals with snow, and the cloth did not smoke. Ellen watched the first of the white cloaks kneel, and felt something settle in her chest she had not known was loose. Not relief for Aegon alone, not gratitude for Visenya's steel. It was the feeling one has when a house's frame is braced at last in the right place. She looked down at Artos asleep in a basket on the table, and thought, "Learn these shapes, child. The things that hold a world are not only banners and maps. They are men who get up when it is still dark and decide the way their feet will face for the sake of someone else's sleep." They left the fort to its own making and went back north, because Winterfell was part of Aegon's reign now, and would require the Rain's presence, not just its seal. On the road, news waited for them as it always does when men are important to other men's plans. Viken Greyjoy had been raised Lord of the Iron Islands by Ironborn acclamation and Aegon's acceptance. He had scowled through the ceremony with the honest vexation of a man who enjoys being chosen, but hates the choosing. He wrote like a smith. Short, hot words, none wasted. He pledged salt and iron, and the troublesome loyalty of a sea that loves no master. Ellen thought, the sea is a dragon. It will have to be courted steps at a time. In the Riverlands, Edmund Tully's letters had taken on a roundness that pleased Ellen. He was learning the pronouns of ruling, the we and the ours that are not lies when looked after properly. At the Rock, Lauren Lannister sent an apology written in gold ink for a matter so small. Ellen suspected the apology cost more than the offense. In The Reach, Harlan Tyrell wrote with a gardener's pride of young men teaching old vines new trellises. And in Dorne, Princess Miriam Martell, old and unafraid and blind in both eye and mercy, sent nothing but this: we have long memories. Then we will give them something worth remembering, Aegon said, turning the parchment under the candle's light as if he might wring more from it by heat alone. Ellen said, or you will wait until the wind changes on its own. He looked at her. Will you have me do nothing? Not nothing, she said. Not only the one thing a man with dragons thinks of first. There are other ways to come into a room than the door of fire. He did not promise. He did not refuse. It is a weariness to be married to a king. It is also a kind of fire. She was learning to warm herself at it without thinking she could sit in the flames and not be burned. Back in Winterfell, the season had shifted its chair. The snow was mostly a memory one could dig a heel into at the edge of shade. The baths breathed like beasts asleep. Torrin met them with a ledger under his arm, and a look of a man glad of company in a house he loved more in quiet than in noise. He walked Aegon along a line of figures in a neat hand. Grain as promised to the Trident, he said. Timber measured and marked for your new city. A count of men we can spare to your roads without leaving ours to go to tracks between puddles. A list of women who will kick my shins if I take their sons for anything more than a month at a time. Mensal. Aegon listened with the attention he saved for such men. If every lord I kept had your neighbor's jealousy of his own people's comfort, he said, I would never sleep. If every lord I kept loved his people as you do, I would not need to. The Crips called to Aegon that evening with the voice they use for all men who think they will not hear it, and then find they cannot pretend otherwise. Ellen went down with him because she always went down alone and wanted, just once, to stand in that cool, flickering company with someone who would keep his voice right without being told. Aegon's footsteps were courteous on the stone. He looked into the long faces of the kings of winter, and did not make a crown of his own pride to wear while looking. When they came to the newest empty niche, the one a boy had scraped stale bits of candle from with a knife, and whistled to keep the dead from feeling snubbed. Aegon touched the lintel. Someday, he said, a son with hair like snow and eyes like a river will lay me in a place like this. Not here. Not under this earth. But in a cool place where good men do not speak because their words would be a kind of rudeness. And you are not afraid? Ellen asked. I am, he said simply. But it is a fear that sharpens. It does not make me drop what I carry. He drew Blackfire then, slowly, so as not to wake what should not be woken, and held it where the candlelight could right itself along the ripples of the steel. Your sword, he said, is the winter I cannot name. Mine is the summer that kills men too quickly. Between them, he did not finish. He did not need to. She knew. Between them lies the season men can live in. The days crept forward as they do when the work is large and the hours are small. Ellen found herself in the counting house as often as in the yard, and just as often in the kitchens where the smell of onions and marrow and meat could mend feuds that treaties could not. Aegon learned which of the kennel hounds would not bite if you looked them in the left eye first, and which would bite if you looked them anywhere. Rainey set a chair in the bathhouse corridor, hiked her skirts to the knee, and learned from old Ellis how to net laundry to the steam and dry it in half the time. She claimed it made her a better rider, and perhaps it did, because a woman who knows how to keep linen sweet will always be loved by the small invisible gods of households, who can make a stirrup leather kind or cruel. Visenya organized the armory as if a war would break upon them that afternoon, and allowed no one, to put a spear back dull. Letters went and came the way breath does in a sleeping body. From Aegonfort came word that men had begun to call the place King's Landing, because there was no escaping what had happened there, and there is comfort in naming the inevitable. From White Harbor came a design for a coin that showed a direwolf's head facing a dragon's, their mouths not open, their gazes not down. Ellen ran a finger over it and thought of how small a thing can carry a long thought if it is made well. From Old Town came a discreet note that some in the faith were displeased by a marriage that had not passed under crystal. Ellen wrote back quietly about a cord of wool and silk and hands tied under leaves. There are oaths your God recognizes, even if your God did not officiate. She wrote, ask him. Summer held the land like a hand too careful to crush a ripe plum. The air tasted of iron and green and the fat of meat that had eaten well. Ardos learned to stand with his hands braced upon a bench, and then, to everyone's surprise but his own, chose to sit again and slap the warm stone in delight at the sound it made. Rhaenys took him once upon Merax's back not to fly, only to sit and feel the leather under his small palms, and look down the long length of a creature that would never be small. He drooled upon the saddle strap and laughed, and afterwards slept with his mouth open and his hand curled around something none of them could see. They took him to the river, where a boy with a broken lip taught Rhaenys the way to catch trout with bare hands for a second time, and in truth taught Aegon too, though Aegon hid his lessons in the quiet dignity of a king, learning a boy's trick. Visenya did not fish. She sharpened the hooks the boys had bent and taught them to splice line. She nodded once when Ellen thanked her, accepting gratitude like a coin whose weight she had tested. When the second year turned, winter went back to the far woods. Men looked at their boots and thought maybe they might last one more season. And some were right and some were wrong. The fort on the Blackwater became a keep, and then Paul of the Carts, who had never learned to write, but could count faster than a scribe with an abacus, sent up the number of loads of stone that had crossed the bridge, and Ellen sat with Aegon and laughed at the figure, because laughter is one way of putting an arm around a labor that will never love you back. Princess Maria sent another letter. It was shorter than the first. It said, "Do you think your winter will climb our mountains?" It had the smell of yellow dye, and Ellen imagined the old woman with her fingers stained by something bright, because bright things cling to those who are willing to hold them. Aegon's mouth went hard when he read it. "Enough patience," he said softly, to the empty room. Ellen heard the places the words were heavier. She put her hand on his arm. "If you must go," she said, "go like a river." Rivers do not argue with mountains. They go around them, and the mountains make the brag that they did not move, and that is fine, because the river knows where it is going. "I have dragons," he said. "You have," she agreed. "Use them like a man holding a torch in a granary." He did not swear to her. He did not need to. When he went south that season, he did so with care braided into his banners, and though the sands drank blood, they did not drink as much as they might have if he had chosen to make a moral out of fire. Men in the Reach grumbled. Men in the Stormlands wished for a quicker tale to tell. Aegon came back with singe marks on metal and a story in his eyes he did not tell anyone, not even Ellen. He put his head in her lap in the bathhouse corridor where the stone was warm and the steam gentle, and slept for an hour like a soldier who has guarded through 2 nights and finds himself forgiven. In the years that followed, King's Landing grew in the obstinate way of places that have been told they must exist, and are now learning how. Streets that were mud cured into streets that were ruts, which is progress of a sort. Houses leaned uncertainly toward each other, and then learned not to lean so far. Squares that were puddles became markets that remembered the puddles when it rained. The smell was always a story told too loudly. Tar and fish, human and horse, garlic and tallow and honesty. Aegon kept his seat on the hill. He made no marble palace. He walked among carpenters with his hands behind his back, and asked after the health of men he could name, not because he was kind, though he was, but because he wanted a city that would think of him like a neighbor and not a lord. Visenya rode patrols as if there were enemies hidden at the bottom of every well. This made thieves behave. Rhaenys bought a bird from a man with no shoes and set it free, and even the thieves watched to see how it flew. Winterfell did not sulk when Aegon was gone. It had been long without kings at times, and had learned to wear the quiet with grace. Ellen found that she missed the particular weight of his hand at the small of her back, and she found that she enjoyed the way the castle breathed in his absence, a little deeper, as if remembering its own lungs. She wrote to him in long letters that did not pretend a wife's fretting. She told him what the spring smelled like after rain, and which woman had scolded which man in the yard so thoroughly the ravens had fallen silent to listen. He wrote back shorter, but his shortness had warmth. He told her when the tide came in wrong and when it came right, and when it changed his mind in the middle of a sentence, and left him laughing on a dock with seaweed on his boot. Ardos learned to walk on a day when the yard was a bright sheet of hard frost, and the sun hammered the edges of everything until they sang. He did it by accident, because all true beginnings are accidents disguised as plans. He reached for a hound's ear, and the hound moved, and he followed with his feet without asking them if they were ready. Ellen caught him before he went face first into a barrel, and laughed so hard she frightened 2 chickens. "Your son is not afraid of falling," Visenya observed. And the pride in her voice was a thing Ellen tucked away for a day when pride would be scarcer. "Then teach him how to stand," Ellen said. "Falling he will learn without us." In Old Town, the Citadel debated whether to write the union of wolf and dragon. Consequences in grain and war. The younger maesters wanted to measure bushels and bodies, and draw a line between them. The elder preferred to mutter about precedent and beware of women under trees with red leaves. One man wrote on a wax tablet, "The North's hot springs may be as critical as its iron," and then wiped it clean because he did not want to be laughed at. A woman in the kitchen poured honey and thought, "Those kings have done a thing that makes men sleep easier. I do not need a book to tell me so." There were years when the snow did not come until late, and years when it came early and crowded into doorways like a proud guest who does not wait to be invited. There were summers of fat frogs in cisterns and summers of thin goats who ate the handles off brooms. Through them, the road between Winterfell and King's Landing thickened with the traffic of men who had business and remembered to bring their humor. The first inns learned to keep 2 kinds of prayers pinned above the hearth: the 7 small stars and a sprig of red leaves that were only holly, but fooled no one and offended none. On good nights, women sang the song of the binding under the heart tree, and men kept their cups low and listened. On bad nights, knives came out and men bled, and the innkeep's wife washed the floor with vinegar and lime water in the morning, and muttered that kings should legislate better behavior into men. Ellen sent coin to those inns without saying why. When Rhaenys gave birth to Aenys, Ellen sent a cradle board carved by a Winterfell carpenter who had never seen the sea, and had put a wave on it wrong, and made the wrongness beautiful by making the wave a wolf's back. Rhaenys wrote back a letter that smelled faintly of milk and triumph. "He has a mouth like a thief," she wrote. "He steals sleep with it." Ellen held the letter to her face and smiled. Later, when Visenya's son Maegor came into the world with a silence that made grown men look out windows for no reason, Ellen sent a small wolf carved of the same wood and an iron teething ring forged by a man who said, "Biting is how men learn the world," and spat to the side for luck. It would please a singer to say that jealousy came like a cold wind into the hall where 3 queens sat. Sings love a storm in the skirts of women. But in truth, envy was a quieter thing, and mostly absent. It peeped its head up when a nurse bragged too much. It showed its teeth when a lord talked as if sons were coins and daughters only copper. It asked sometimes in Ellen's ear how the world would measure a northern wife beside the 2 who had flown down flames upon kings. Ellen told it to go to the crypts and learn how to keep its mouth shut. She had a boy to keep alive and a city to help make, and a husband who came and went like weather and needed to be reminded which season he was in when he came. There's no time for envy when the pots must be stirred. and a letter must be answered in a tone that will not turn a prickly lord into a porcupine with a pen. She sat sometimes with Torrin on the covered walk above the yard, where the steam curled and flattened itself against the pillars. He had a way of counting that never needed beads. He moved his fingers in the air and put men and barley and iron in their right places. "I thought I would die with a crown upon my head," he said once, not sadly. "Now I will die with a fire above my feet." "Whose?" Ellen asked, smiling. "Yours," he said, and tipped his head toward the heart tree. When he died, years later, he did it as he had lived, without drama, with the household in order, with a hand on the ledger and another on the arm of the chair where he sat. They put him in the crypt with the kings who had not bent before him. Men came who had sworn to him, and men came who had sworn to Aegon, and men came who had sworn to no one but themselves, and wanted to see what a man looks like who chose warmth over pride. Aegon stood beside Ellen and held Artos's shoulder in a grip that told the boy many things without speech. "Remember him. Take his kind of measure for your own. Do not mistake gentleness for softness." The winter after, the snow came early, as if to make sure the land did not grow arrogant with the memory of a warm king. Life went on in its busy, splendid pettiness. There were disputes over a pig that had a mottled ear, and was therefore obviously the priest's, according to the priest. There were fields flooded where a ditch had been cut wrong by a man with more heart than I. There were lovers who carved their initials into a doorpost, and were scolded by a stern woman, and then given a small loaf, as if to say, "I am stern because doors are dear, not because doors are dear, not because—" There were dragons overhead that made children laugh, and ducks scatter, and smiths swear, and then grin. There was a king who learned that paper cuts can hurt worse than sword wounds when the paper writes men's fates upon it. There were queens who grew older without apology, and with a competence that made the whole thing look easier than it was. Once, in the 7th summer since the binding, Ellen went alone into the godswood at dusk, because the air had a shape that meant a storm had not decided, and she wanted to hear the undeciding. The heart tree looked down with its old indifference, which he had come to think of as a kind of trust. The tree was not worried because it had seen so many Starks not lose themselves, that it expected her to do as they had done in her own way. She put her hand upon the cold bark and said aloud, "To no one, and to the dead, and to herself. We have made a thing that can be broken. All good things can." The wind leaned the leaves as if to say, "Ask me for certainty, and I will deny you because certainty is not for women who mean to live." She laughed then, softly, so as not to be rude in a place that dislikes loudness. "I will take that," she said. "I will take a thing that requires tending. I will wake to it and lay down with it, and draw breath into it when it falters. If it dies, it will not be because we did not feed it." When she turned, Artos was at the edge of the pool, his reflection a soft smudge in the skin of water. He had come as boys do, with the quiet that is not sneaking, but the earnestness of a child who wants to do a thing and knows noise will obligate him to answer questions. He looked up. In his face were 5 men she had known, and 3 she had not yet, and 2 women, and the tree's red leaf caught in his hair and making a foolish crown. He said nothing. He did not need to. He had brought the small wooden wolf she had given him and set it at the foot of the tree, as if a boy could bargain with old gods by offering them a toy. Perhaps he could. Perhaps the gods, who do not speak, do not mind being played with so long as the play is earnest. The ravens were noisy on the roof that week, and the rookery smelled of straw and guano and news. Ellen climbed the steps herself, because there are places in a castle a queen must step into in person, or else she has only the idea of a castle and not a house. The maester dozed on a stool with a feather in his hair and a piece of string in his hand, and she loved him then, at that ungainly angle, because it is a mercy to see the servants of wisdom exhausted by the same small labors as the rest of us. She woke him gently and stood with him while he broke seals. Some letters are old women's bones, light, brittle, full of ache. Some are young men's arms, hot and shabby and eager to throw punches. Some are children's teeth, small and sharp and uncomfortable to face. That week, they were mostly bread. Trade tallies, marriage proposals, a note from Shara Aaron asking, sly as rain, if Ellen would like hawk's bells, in exchange for a certain number of lampreys. Ellen sent bells and lampreys both, because there is no reason to deny a woman her foolish wants, when she keeps a mountain wearing a crown from rolling down onto your lowlands. A letter from Aegon came last. His hand was quick, the way it was when he wrote with the ink still wet on his mind. King's Landing had had a fire, no great thing, but it had made him think of how quickly flame tells its own story, uncaring for anyone else's. He wrote of a woman whose house had burned and who had stood with her arm over her eyes like a visor, and laughed because she hated the house, and now had an excuse to make it as it ought to have been. He wrote of a boy who had stolen a pomegranate from a trader's cart, and run until his lungs burned, and when he was caught had cried because the fruit looked like a jewel, and he wanted his mother to see something beautiful. He wrote of the way the tide made patterns in the mud that reminded him of the grain outside Winterfell, when the wind runs in devious lanes across it. He wrote, at the end, the thing he never said when he was in the room. I am better here because I am better there. You have made a season I can carry. She pressed the letter to her mouth and smiled into the paper like a foolish girl. Then she folded it and put it in the coffer that held a lock of her mother's hair and a pebble from the river, where she had once learned to swim, and the first small shoe Artos had worn and scuffed to ruin, on a day when he decided running was better than walking, and therefore entirely the point of a body. In the winter of the 9th year, the snow came with a mind to stay, and the springs breathed harder as if to comfort men, and were insulted by the size of their own breath. The dragons flew low, so their bellies brushed the fog, and came back, rimed at the edges like meat kept too long in a larder. Aegon brought Rhaenys north, and she laughed at the steam like a child greeting a clever dog. I am always surprised, she said to Ellen in the bathhouse corridor, hair pinned in a dozen careless spears, that you live inside the earth's breath. It is like sleeping in a giant's mouth. Giants are dead, Ellen said, smiling. You say that the way other women say, my husband travels for his work. Rhaenys replied and laughed, and then sighed for a baby who demanded her and flew on. Visenya came last, as she often did, taking the measure of a place after it had been measured by others. She walked the godswood with Ellen, and did not touch the tree, and did not spit aside, and did not pray. She looked up into the red and said, this is the only place I have ever felt something that could forbid me, and be right. You listen, Ellen said. That is why you hear it. Do you think, Visenya asked, that when we are gone, the men who follow will remember to tie their names to something older than themselves? Some will, Ellen said. Some will try to tie their names to themselves, and wonder when the knot will not hold and blame the rope. Visenya laughed in a short breath. You speak like a man with a map. I have been married to one, Ellen said. It rubs off. In King's Landing, the first plank of a wharf that would matter 100 years from now, creaked into place under a boy's bare feet. In White Harbor, a shipwright shaved a sliver from a beam, and put it to his tongue to taste the resin, which is something men do when they do not trust their eyes alone. In the Reach, a new variety of apple was grafted because a woman with small hands and a careful thumb thought it might take the cold better if it had a little of the north in it. In Dorne, an old woman who had outlived daughters and grandsons put her hand on the wall of a sun-hot house and told it the names of her dead, and laughed at herself for the habit, and then did it again because it comforted her, and the house did not object. The Song of the Binding. Changed verses. As songs do when they grow into their own legs. Minstrels added a line about the boy who laughed at the dragon's shadow. They argued in tavern corners about whether the wolf should sing first or the dragon, as if sequence could unmake truth. In Winterfell's small hall, a new singer tried a verse about jealousy between queens and was politely asked to eat his stew outside. He did, and sang to the hounds, who did not mind. Ellen grew older in the way that makes men stand up when she enters a room and forget that she had ever been young. It is a privilege to age into a shape that matches a house. She learned to read a man's temper by the way he put down a spoon, and the state of a lady's marriage by the set of her hair. She kept fewer secrets and kept them better. Ardos grew into a boy who had more scars on his knees than words in his mouth, and then into a youth whose mouth caught up and made up for lost time. He argued with Brandon Snow with joy, which is the only good way to argue with uncles. Once, as a summer storm bruised the horizon and the heat made fabric cling like damp hands, Aegon came to her angry, in the way of a man whose anger is not at a single thing, but at the sum of many small disappointments. A lord who had lied on paper, and a ditch cut wrong, and a scribe who had spelled a name as if a man's name were a thing to be bent. He put his palms on the table and breathed, as if fire would leap from his mouth if air did not. And Ellen did the one thing that has any hope in such hours. She did not meet him with water for his flames, or with more flame. She put her hands over his, palm to palm, and she named each small disappointment out loud, and she put it in a place on the table with her words, as if arranging bowls. When she finished, there was very little left that was not named. Aegon's breath changed. He laughed, which came out like a cough. He kissed her knuckles, in the way of a soldier who knows what saves him is not always a sword. "When I die," he said, "not as a flourish, but because the thought had come and needed trodden, will they say, I kept faith with a tree?" "They will say," Ellen replied, "that you kept faith with what your own hands could not break. And you, I will be here," she said, "in the stones, in the baths, in the faces of women who refuse foolishness with their eyebrows alone." He told her then, in his own rough way, that she had made him a season he had not known he could inhabit. He told her he had expected to be a summer that burned and left fields behind him too eager to grow, and then dismayed by their own greed. She had made him autumn sometimes, and spring often, and winter when he needed to be held still. When news came, years later, of Rhaenys and Meraxes falling at Hellholt, to a bolt that had been sung about by men who think triumph is carried only in the tips of weapons, the North held its breath with the rest of the world. Aegon's grief was a private thing that wore a public face for as many days as the realm required. He sat with Ellen in the warm dim, and did not weep, and did not shatter. He put his hand against the stone where steam rose and said, in a voice only she would hear, "I have always believed in fire that did not lie. It can lie. It can be taken from us by a string drawn back by hands that do not deserve the power they borrow." Ellen put her head against his shoulder. "Every honest thing can be stolen," she said. "That is not a reason to live among thieves." Visenia's face became a blade honed past sorrow. She went about the halls with a purpose that made men step aside simply because her feet had decided on a path. The white cloak stood closer, and the air around Aegon changed. It did not sour. It became thin, as if the world had been lifted a little, and all breathing required intention. The North kept its vows. It sent men. It sent grain. It sent letters written in a plain hand that told the truth to the line and then stopped, which is a Stark's way of saying, "We will do what we said, and no more words will make it truer." The years bent toward the shape they had to take. Children grew and learned the names of swords and the names of herbs, and which names to say, in which rooms. The broad, stubborn rope of realm twisted with more wool and more silk. It frayed at times, and was mended, and made stronger for the mending. There were days when Ellen envied women whose greatest concern was the state of a pickle, and then, remembering the importance of a good pickle to winter, laughed at her own foolishness, and went to the cellar to make sure brine was as it should be. There were nights when the spring sang loud enough to drown a man's fear, and there were mornings when even the hottest baths could not thaw the dread at the base of a spine that is part of any house, remembering that the far north is not a story, but a place with teeth. She dreamed once, late, years after the binding, that she stood on the wall of King's Landing, and looked north, and could see the heart tree, as if the land were a flat table, and she were a girl again convinced that distances are silly inventions. In the dream, the tree's leaves fell, and did not stop falling, and each leaf was a coin with a wolf and a dragon pressed on it, and common girls picked them up and put them in their mouths to see if they were sweet. She woke laughing because in the dream the coins had tasted of lemon cakes and onion soup, and not of copper or of God. She did not tell Aegon the dream. Some things are meant for the private pantry where a woman keeps the food that feeds only her and her courage. When she died, because all good long labors end, she did it in a season that would be called mild, if any season in the north allows such words. She lay with her hand on stone that knew her, in a room where the breath of the earth kept the air honest. She had not been sick so much as done. There is a difference, and women know it, and so do old hounds. Aegon sat with her and held her wrist until he could not feel what he had always felt there, and then held it a while longer, because the hand remembers its own work and will not be told by a pulse when to stop. Artos stood at the window, a man now, with his face the sort that makes old women cry, because it is fine and kind and will have to suffer therefore. Visenya stood at the foot of the bed with her palms together, as if the old gods might be tricked into seeing her if she stood in the right shape. The springs breathed. Ellen's mouth held a small smile she had practiced when reading letters that could not be answered and had never learned to love. After, the heart tree did not speak. The seven were not invited, and would not have been offended anyway, because the weather of grief is the same under any god. They put her beneath the stones with the quiet usual to such work, with a candle that gutters for a moment, and then steadies, with a child crying somewhere because someone took a crust he had set aside for later. Aegon stood above and did not make a speech. He put his hand upon the lintel and said, "We tied a knot and it held," which is perhaps the only eulogy that matters in a house full of old names. The binding had done what it was made to do. Winter did not kneel, it learned another gait. Fire did not lord, it learned another appetite. The north remained the north in the way that keeps men alive, which is to say it endured and changed, and endured again. King's Landing's mud grew cobblestones that would last long enough to make men curse them and want them replaced. The coin with two faces got rubbed smooth on one side in some years, and on the other, in others, and sometimes on both, until only the weight was left, which is also truth. Artos would grow into a man with a hand for bridles and a mind for counts. He would stand upon the wall and feel the old fear take his throat like an old friend's hand, and he would not pretend otherwise. He would hold a child in the bathhouse corridor and feel the steam like blessing. He would hear in Old Town, where he went once to see the lamps, a singer play the binding song with the wolf first and the dragon after, and he would stop the man and say, "You have it wrong," and then laugh and toss a coin and say, "No, you have it as you like. We built it so you could choose." Aegon would go on as kings do, until he did not. He would be praised for things he had done, and blamed for things he had not, and finally reduced, in some men's mouths, to a season. He did not mind. He had learned to be a man in a house that smelled of iron and bread, and the earth's breath. He had learned to stand under a tree that did not speak, and be corrected by the quiet. He had learned that the kind of oath that holds is not the kind men shout in halls, but the kind they whisper in corridors, warm with steam, while children sleep. And the realm, poor, hungry, greedy, holy, foolish, brave, tender thing, would tell the story of a morning at the Trident when a wolf asked a dragon to be kin and the dragon agreed. And both kept their word. Men would argue about the dates. Women would argue about the food at the wedding. Priests would argue about the rightness of vows spoken beneath red leaves. And the old gods would not argue because that is not their way. The road between the hill and the hot stones would be walked and worn and mended and walked again. The springs would go on breathing under Winterfell like a promise the earth had made long before men thought to make their own. And the red leaves would go on trembling their little talk to one another, saying nothing men could hear, and everything that mattered anyway.